Before anyone spoke of England, before a single king ruled this island, there was fear. Villages burned in the night. Monasteries vanished under storms of Viking steel. Across the North Sea came armies that moved like a living tide, fast, brutal, unstoppable. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell until only Wessex remained. A final scrap of land, a final hope, and its king. He was not the towering hero you might expect. Alfred was sick, in constant pain, haunted by defeat, his army shattered, his allies scattered. For a brief moment he had no throne at all. He hid in the marshes, cold, starving, disguised, living like a fugitive while Viking warlords carved up his kingdom. But here's the part history books never quite explain. From those same marshes, from that lowest point, Alfred would rise to do something almost impossible. He would reorganize a terrified population. He would rebuild an army from nothing. He would design a defensive system, so advanced it changed warfare in Western Europe. And he would lead one of the most unlikely comebacks in medieval history. This is not legend. This is the true, impossible story of Alfred the Great, the king who should have died in the swamp, but didn't, and the world that followed because of it. Picture a winter so severe that even warriors feared the cold. In 878, the Viking assault didn't just defeat Anglo-Saxon England, it dismantled it. Strongholds surrendered without resistance. Entire families fled south with nothing but smoke behind them. And on many maps, Wessex simply stopped being drawn. Its king, Alfred, was not on a throne. He was disguised as a common traveler, moving from hut to hut through the marshes of Athelney, carrying messages at night because daylight was too dangerous. His body was failing him. His confidence was faltering. Some days, he wasn't sure he would ever reclaim his crown. Yet from those same swamps, muddy, cold, and almost forgotten, Alfred began planning a return no one believed possible. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary political and military resurgences in medieval history. Most medieval heroes come from legend. Alfred's story didn't need legend. It was already on the edge of disappearing. While Viking armies roamed freely across his homeland, Alfred was hiding in the marshes with so few followers that he knew each man by name. He begged local farmers for information, sent secret messengers through swamps at night, and plotted strategy from a hut barely big enough for a bed. From these scraps he built something radical, a network of fortified burhs, early warning strongholds that reshaped how England fought. Villagers could flee inside them. Soldiers could strike out from them. Armies that once vanished were suddenly holding the line. And somehow, in the middle of all this desperation, Alfred fought for more than survival. He personally translated books to keep learning alive. He wrote laws. He planned for a future almost no one could imagine. This isn't a tale of a king rising from comfort. It's the story of a man standing on the brink, the world collapsing around him, who refused to accept extinction. But the question is, how does someone that defeated become the architect of a nation? To understand Alfred's rise, we have to step into the world he was born into, a world where nothing felt certain. In the 9th century, the island we now call England wasn't one nation, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia. Each ruled by men who feared their neighbors almost as much as they feared foreign armies. Battles redrew borders every few months. One Mercian king reigned for barely 30 weeks before being murdered by his own guards. In Northumbria, rivals poisoned a ruler in a monastery. Power didn't pass peacefully. It was seized, stolen, or taken from a corpse. Villages changed hands overnight. Families woke up not knowing whose laws they lived under or which warband would march through next. Loyalty was temporary. Stability was an illusion. There was no England yet, only fractured lands, suspicious allies, and a population waiting for the next disaster to decide their fate. Daily life offered no guarantees. One harsh winter could turn a good harvest into famine. A family that went to sleep with enough grain might wake to find their stores spoiled by damp or stolen, by desperate neighbors. Justice depended entirely on the man who ruled your land. A single angry lord could ruin a household with one command, seizing livestock, demanding extra tribute, or dragging a farmer before a makeshift court on a whim. Even the church, the one place meant to offer stability, was struggling. In some monasteries, books were so old and water-damaged that the ink bled into the pages. Younger monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, tracing letters they could hardly read. This wasn't a peaceful age. It was a world held together by thin threads, where one storm, one failed harvest, or one raid could snap everything. And enemies who mastered speed and terror understood exactly how to break those threads. This fragile world met its breaking point when a new kind of Viking force arrived. Earlier raiders came in swift bursts, burn a monastery, steal its silver, disappear into the dawn. But by the mid-800s, everything changed. The great heathen army landed with something England had never seen before: intention. Not a few ships, but fleets crowding rivers so thick they looked like forests of masts. Not handfuls of warriors, but coordinated armies that carved out territory and held it. They built winter camps, fortified towns, really right on English soil. Some villages woke to find earthworks rising around them overnight, their homes absorbed into Viking defenses. Armies marched in seasons when no one else dared, moving with a speed and confidence that terrified Anglo-Saxon commanders. They didn't come to raid, they came to stay. And for a land already stretched to its limits, this was no longer a nuisance. It was an existential invasion unlike anything England had ever faced. By the time Alfred was born in 849, the Vikings were already reshaping Europe with fire and fear. Their longships slid up rivers like silent blades, appearing in places no one thought an enemy could reach. Entire communities vanished before sunrise, leaving behind nothing but smoke, shattered doors, and stories whispered in terror. Imagine growing up in that world. Alfred did. As a young prince, he listened to travelers speak of kings driven from their halls, of monasteries stripped of their books, of villages erased after a single night. He had visited Rome as a child, seen order, grandeur, and faith, and then returned home to a land where everything felt temporary, fragile, one raid away from ruin. He wasn't raised with the certainty of future rule. He was raised with the fear that his kingdom might not survive long enough for him to inherit it. This was the world that shaped Alfred. A childhood lived under the constant knowledge that Wessex itself could be the next place to burn. Alfred was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, the child least likely to wear a crown, yet the one chroniclers quietly marked as different. Even in a warrior culture, they wrote of his hunger for stories, his fascination with language, and a seriousness unusual for someone so small. At 5 years old, he traveled with his father to Rome, a journey almost unimaginable for an Anglo-Saxon prince. Picture the child stepping from the muddy roads of Wessex into a city of marble colonnades, gilded shrines, incense-thick air, and priests chanting in Latin he couldn't yet understand. The scale of it must have overwhelmed him. A world so old, so vast, that it made his own homeland feel like a fragile corner of something greater. But that shock became a seed. In Rome, Alfred saw power built on faith, law, and knowledge, not just armies. It was his first glimpse of the kind of ruler he might one day need to become, long before he ever imagined he would be one. When Alfred returned to Wessex, he carried more than memories of Rome. He carried a hunger for stories, languages, and law. But the world he came home to was anything but peaceful. In the royal hall, candlelight flickered over half-read manuscripts while distant horns signaled yet another Viking landing. Scribes struggled to copy fading texts as armed messengers hurried past them with news of burned settlements. Inside the court, politics were no less dangerous. Rival nobles whispered in corners, alliances shifted overnight, and even the king's council sometimes erupted into arguments that came close to violence. Alfred learned early that knowledge could be a shield, but it wouldn't spare him from the chaos around him. Slowly, he began to understand a hard truth. A kingdom couldn't survive on force alone. It needed structure. It needed learning. It needed a shared idea of what it meant to belong to Wessex. And Alfred, still young but already observant, started shaping the vision he would one day build. One book, one law, and one fortress at a time. Alfred's path to kingship was anything but inevitable. As a young prince, he stood beside his brothers as they took the throne in turn. First Ethelstan, then Ethelbald, then Ethelbert, watching each of them age faster than the years allowed. He saw illness hollow one brother's face, saw another return from battle trembling with exhaustion, saw the weight of leadership break men he admired. Every death pulled him a step closer to a destiny he had never wanted, and Alfred carried his own burden. Chronic pain struck him without warning, sometimes in the middle of ceremonies, sometimes during training, sometimes in the stillness of night when he could no longer hide it. Some believed he suffered from a lifelong inflammatory illness, a condition that made even simple tasks a test of will. Yet he refused to let it define him. He studied harder, listened more closely, and shaped his mind into a weapon none could see. His suffering didn't weaken him, it prepared him. And soon, when Wessex faced its darkest hour, Alfred would become the king no one expected, at the exact moment England needed him most. By 871, Alfred became king, not in triumph, but in the shadow of disaster. The Viking armies had already crushed Northumbria and East Anglia. Mercia was collapsing. Wessex stood alone, a single island of resistance in a sea of defeat. His coronation didn't feel like a celebration. The crowd gathered because they had to, not because they felt hope. Soldiers stood nearby with torn cloaks and hollow eyes. Smoke from recently burned villages drifted on the wind. Even as Alfred received the crown, he kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see enemy sails rising out of the morning fog. He inherited a broken treasury, battered armies, and a population living with fear carved into their faces. This wasn't a moment of glory. It was a warning: survive, or watch the last free kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons disappear. And Alfred understood instantly that the crown on his head was heavier than gold. It was the weight of survival itself. The first years of Alfred's reign were a trial by fire. Viking warbands struck without pattern, raiding one month, negotiating the next, breaking treaties the moment it suited them. A village could wake to quiet birdsong, and minutes later burn beneath a sky choked with smoke. Farmers dropped their plows mid-furrow when scouts came rushing in, breathless, shouting warnings. Families grabbed what they could carry and fled down muddy tracks as warriors in wolf paint surged out of the tree line. Alfred's men, ordinary laborers, marched into battle wearing the dirt of their fields, their stomachs half empty, their limbs exhausted from days of toil. Some battles Alfred won by courage alone. Others he lost to sheer Viking discipline. His army lived scattered across Wessex, tied to harvests, homes, and kin. A full-time professional force was a luxury he simply couldn't sustain. The Vikings, by contrast, were forged for war, trained, ruthless, and terrifyingly mobile. Their longships slid up rivers like knives through silk, delivering fighters where Wessex least expected them. But it was within these failures, these exhausting retreats, that Alfred began to transform. Each defeat forced him to think more sharply. Each narrow escape taught him to turn weakness into something else, something innovative, unorthodox, and ultimately decisive. Outnumbered, outtrained, outpaced. Yet Alfred was beginning to see patterns in the chaos, and soon he would change the rules of the war entirely. Then came the catastrophe of 878. The Vikings struck in winter, swift, ruthless, and silent beneath a blanket of snow. Footsteps vanished into the white. The only warning was the distant crack of doors smashed open, and the rising screams carried by the frozen wind. Chippenham burned. Smoke drifted across the countryside, sharp and bitter in the air. Families ran through knee-deep drifts, clutching children, coughing through ash. Alfred's own household was nearly taken. One wrong turn, one heartbeat slower, and he would have been slain or captured. Instead, he fled through the snow with only a handful of loyal followers. No horses, no provisions. Just cold breath, pounding hearts, and the fear of shapes moving in the tree line behind them. Their escape led them into the marshes of Athelney, a tangle of mud, bog water, and reed-choked channels. Every step was freezing. Every sound felt dangerous. The marsh swallowed men whole if they strayed even a few feet off the known paths. It was a place meant to break spirits, a place meant to end stories, not begin them. But Alfred did not break. Here, in the wet cold, in isolation and humiliation, he gathered what remained of Wessex's hope. And from this mire, from this lowest of low points, he would ignite one of history's greatest comebacks. Athelney became Alfred's crucible, a world of water, mud, and biting cold. Reeds rattled in the wind. The ground sucked at boots with every step. At night, the marsh froze around their camp, and the distant thrum of Viking war horns drifted across the darkness. Here, hidden in the swamp's maze, Alfred rebuilt himself. Messengers slipped in and out under cover of darkness, moving silently through half-frozen channels to summon the surviving thanes. When they arrived, weary and shivering, Alfred met them in a crude hut lit only by flickering torches. Smoke curled upward. Shadows stretched across maps spread over rough wooden planks. This was not the confident king they had known. This was a man carrying the weight of a dying kingdom on his shoulders. He felt the pressure. Every loss, every village burned, every family displaced. Some nights, exhaustion hit him like a blow. Some mornings, doubt crept in with the mist. But he did not stop. He studied. He planned. He pushed himself to see the kingdom as the Vikings saw it, the weak points, the opportunities, the terrain they underestimated. Every sound outside the camp, every splash in the marsh, reminded him how close the enemy was, how little time he had. People tell stories about burnt cakes and simple disguises, but the truth is more remarkable. In this damp, freezing wilderness, Alfred was reshaping the very idea of kingship. He was turning fear into resolve, chaos into strategy, despair into a plan for survival. And from the heart of this swamp, a new kind of king was emerging, one ready to strike back and reclaim Wessex. By spring, Alfred was ready to rise from the marshes and take back his kingdom. He sent out a summons, quiet at first, then spreading like a spark through the countryside, calling every loyal warrior to meet him at Egbert's Stone. A place of memory, a place meant to remind Wessex of what it once was and what it could be again. They came slowly, in ones and twos, then in weary clusters. Farmers trudged through knee-deep mud, their boots heavy, their faces gaunt from months of hiding. They carried axes still smelling of sap, not blood. Behind them came nobles on horseback, armor dented, cloaks tattered, each man wondering whether this young king, this fugitive, could truly lead them. Survivors of burned villages approached quietly, wrapped in blankets and grief, gripping whatever weapons they could salvage. The morning air was cold. Mist clung to the earth. Torches flickered against the standing stone, their light wavering in the wind. It was not an army at first glance. It was a collection of the broken, the tired, the nearly defeated. But Alfred saw more. He saw the last hope of Wessex. He moved among them, speaking to men who had lost everything, reminding them that the fight was not over. He promised a chance, not certainty, but a chance to reclaim their land. Some were skeptical, some were afraid. A few considered slipping away before dawn, but they stayed. Slowly, under Alfred's steady voice and fierce resolve, these scattered fragments began to form something new. Not the largest force, not the best equipped, but one bound together by desperation, courage, and the shared understanding that there was nowhere left to run. This gathering at Egbert's Stone was only the beginning. Ahead of them loomed a single, brutal truth. One battle, just one, would decide whether Wessex endured or disappeared forever. The decisive moment came at Edington. Alfred marched out to face Guthrum, the Viking warlord whose discipline and brutality had crushed every kingdom before Wessex. This was no ordinary battle. It was survival itself. Dawn broke through a haze of smoke. The two armies advanced. Then a thunderous crash, shield wall against shield wall, wood splintering, metal screaming, men roaring, arrows hissed overhead, vanishing into the fog of breath and sweat. Spears struck shields with dull, bone-deep thuds. The ground churned into a slurry of mud and blood beneath thousands of desperate feet. Alfred fought at the front, shoulder to shoulder with the men who had followed him out of the marshes. He shouted orders through the clamor, steadying warriors who faltered, lifting shields that sagged, pushing the line forward inch by inch. More than once he was nearly pulled into the melee, but each time he rose, rallying those around him. Hours dragged on, maybe the whole day. Time meant nothing inside the chaos, and then something broke, a ripple, a crack in the Viking line. Guthrum's warriors began to fall back. Moments later they ran. Wessex had done the impossible. Against a hardened army and overwhelming odds, Alfred and his farmers-turned-fighters held the field. This wasn't just a victory, it was deliverance. It was the moment Wessex and England's future refused to die. Alfred's victory at Edington didn't end on the battlefield. It moved into the realm of negotiations, dangerous, delicate, and every bit as critical as the fighting. Guthrum was cornered but far from powerless. His warriors still outnumbered Alfred's. One wrong word, one flicker of disrespect, and the fragile truce could shatter into bloodshed. Alfred entered the talks knowing that survival, not triumph, was the prize. The meetings were tense. Alfred stood across from Guthrum, a warlord whose reputation for ruthlessness stretched across the North Sea. Guards watched each other with tight, controlled suspicion. Every silence felt longer than it should. But slowly, through patience and resolve, Alfred pulled the moment toward peace. Guthrum agreed to be baptized, an extraordinary gesture. Imagine the scene. The Viking leader standing before the baptismal font, water trickling down his forehead, his face unreadable. His warriors looked on, some uneasy, others defiant, knowing they were crossing into a world governed by different laws and gods. Under the terms, they would withdraw and settle in East Anglia. It was the birth of a new political reality. Wessex in the south and the Danelaw to the north and east. An uneasy balance forged from exhaustion, strategy, and necessity. It wasn't unity. It wasn't victory in the way legends often claim, but it was survival, precious, fragile survival. And from that survival, the foundations of a future England began to take shape. Alfred understood that one battlefield victory could never secure the future of Wessex. The Vikings would return, stronger, faster, and without warning. If the kingdom was to survive, it needed something more permanent than courage. So he began rebuilding the realm from the ground up. Fortifications rose across the landscape, burhs, the backbone of a new defensive network. Earthen walls climbed skyward. Timber palisades were hammered into place. Watchtowers stood tall, their silhouettes catching the dawn light as lookouts scanned the horizons for sails or smoke. Inside these burhs, life transformed. Soldiers trained in tight formations, learning discipline instead of relying on raw courage. Traders set up stalls under the safety of the walls. Families fleeing raids arrived breathless, clutching children and belongings, finding protection behind defenses that had never existed before. The atmosphere inside was alive, busy, tense, determined. You could hear the clang of metalwork, the murmured prayers of families rebuilding from ruin, the calls of guards atop the walls. The burhs weren't just military shields. They became the first sparks of urban life, places where commerce, culture, and community began to grow. With each burh, Alfred was doing more than defending Wessex. He was creating the framework of a society that could endure, a kingdom built not just to resist destruction, but to outlast it. Alfred didn't stop at forts. He reinvented the very rhythm of military life. Across Wessex, farmers rose before sunrise to tend their fields, and by evening, some traded plows for spears. Alfred created a system of rotation, one force guarding the kingdom, the other working the land, then switching before exhaustion or famine could take hold. You could see lines of men marching from villages to bars, shields slung over shoulders, nodding to neighbors who were heading back to harvest. Families watched them go with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing their defenders would return and knowing others would take their place. Fields stayed alive, armies stayed ready. No village was left unprotected, not even for a moment. This wasn't just administration, it was survival made systematic, a standing defensive force without destroying the economy. No Anglo-Saxon king had ever managed such balance. Alfred wasn't merely preparing for the next attack. He was building a kingdom resilient enough to withstand any that followed. Alfred knew that defending Wessex meant controlling more than fields and fortresses. He needed the rivers, the coastline, the open sea. So he turned to shipbuilding, an ambition no Anglo-Saxon king had attempted at this scale. Across Wessex, the sound of hammers echoed through makeshift dockyards. Workers shaped towering oak planks, hauling them into place with ropes that strained under the weight. Sparks flew as iron nails bit into wood. Day by day, long, lean warships took form, vessels broader and faster than anything the Vikings brought across the water. Some launches failed. Ships sat too deep in the water. Others handled poorly in the wind. But Alfred watched, learned, adjusted. Each mistake sharpened the next attempt. Soon, these new ships slid into rivers and harbors, cutting through the water like spearheads. Crews rowed hard against the tide, eyes fixed on the horizon, ready for sails or shadows that didn't belong. For the first time, the Vikings were not the only predators at sea. With this fleet, imperfect, experimental but revolutionary, Alfred forged the first organized English navy. A new line of defense, a new balance of power, and the earliest spark of a maritime legacy that would shape Britain for centuries. By the late 880s, Alfred had done more than save his kingdom. He had rebuilt its foundations. Inside his royal study, candlelight flickered against parchment as the king bent over translations, shaping Latin wisdom into English words. Scribes copied his work through the night. In the bars, children sounded out their first lines of scripture. Nobles learned the laws they were now expected to uphold. Justice grew clearer. Learning spread wider. Order returned. These were not abstract reforms. Ordinary people felt the difference. Markets were safer. Disputes were settled more fairly. A farmer in the Shire, a merchant in a growing town, a young boy in a monastery school, all lived in a world steadier than the one Alfred inherited. Pride replaced fear. Hope replaced exhaustion. Alfred's reign became the bridge between eras, the dying landscape of post-Roman Britain and the rising identity of what would become England. He was not merely a defender of Wessex. He was the architect of a culture, a legal system, and a language that could endure. From the ashes of invasion, he sparked a renaissance, one his descendants would carry forward, shaping the destiny of a nation. For Alfred, learning was not a luxury, it was a weapon. A kingdom that had nearly been wiped from the map needed more than soldiers. It needed minds. Schools were few. Records were fading. Even nobles struggled to read. Alfred saw the danger, so he acted. Scholars arrived from distant coasts, stepping off boats with scrolls wrapped in cloth. Teachers trained in cramped rooms where candlelight danced across parchment. Students, some young, some already grown, copied lines of history and law until their hands cramped. Imagine one of them, a clerk in a bar, once unable to read more than a prayer. Now he records land rights, settles disputes, brings order where chaos had lived for years. His work is small, but its impact spreads. Alfred walked among these halls, speaking with scholars, checking progress, urging ambition. Short sentences, clear laws, accessible learning. He wanted a kingdom that could think as well as fight. Because in Alfred's vision, literacy wasn't just education, it was survival. A people who could read their past could defend their future. One of Alfred's greatest acts of leadership wasn't fought with steel, it was written in ink. Latin literacy was fading. Entire libraries of wisdom were becoming unreachable. If no one could read these texts, their knowledge would vanish forever. Alfred refused to let that happen. Picture him at a wooden desk, quill in hand, translating line after line. Scholars worked beside him, candles burning low, their manuscripts glowing in the dim light. Pages whispered as they copied each word, determined to carry this knowledge across the kingdom. Texts like Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care and Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy were no longer distant or elite. They were now tools, practical guides for officials in boroughs, for judges, for young nobles learning how to lead. Imagine an administrator unrolling a freshly copied manuscript, reading advice once locked behind a foreign tongue, feeling a sense of clarity, even empowerment. These were not mere translations. They were acts of preservation, acts of defiance. Alfred was saving a civilization's memory, one page at a time, proving that a kingdom survives not only by the strength of its warriors, but by the wisdom it chooses to keep alive. Alfred didn't just command translations, he wrote in them. Picture him in the dim glow of candlelight, quill moving steadily across parchment as scribes worked beside him, their manuscripts spreading across the table like maps of knowledge he was determined to reclaim. In the prefaces he penned, Alfred revealed a mind thinking far beyond the next battle. He worried about a future where no one could read the laws, the histories, or the wisdom of the past. He feared a kingdom blind to its own memory. But fear didn't paralyze him, it pushed him. Sentence by sentence, he laid out a plan to rebuild learning, train teachers, educate nobles, restore clarity to governance. His words are humble, almost confessional at times, yet filled with resolve. For Alfred, learning was not an ornament of kingship. It was survival, the difference between a kingdom that endures and one that collapses again into darkness. Literacy was no longer just a mark of learning. It became the backbone of power. Alfred understood that without written law, a kingdom could fracture from the inside long before enemies appeared at the gates. Picture him reviewing manuscripts in his hall, scribes waiting as he dictated revisions. Then the laws spread outward, carried to boroughs, read aloud to local officials, copied and posted for all to hear. Alfred blended older Anglo-Saxon codes with biblical principles, shaping rules built on fairness, proportion, and clarity. These weren't abstract ideals. They changed lives. Disputes over land were settled without bloodshed. Villagers knew what to expect from their lords. Even powerful thanes found themselves bound by written justice. Short sentences, clear meaning, predictable law. This was Alfred's shield against corruption and chaos, a safeguard for a kingdom that had nearly collapsed. By giving Wessex rules everyone could understand, he gave it something even more valuable: stability. As Wessex steadied itself, Alfred turned to a threat less visible than Viking steel. Economic collapse. Years of raids had shattered trade. Coins varied wildly in weight and purity. Merchants hesitated. Markets faltered. So Alfred acted. In minting halls, hammers rang as new, standardized coins took shape, uniform, trusted, unmistakably royal. Officials tested weight and silver content. Merchants examined the coins with cautious hope. Farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople traded with confidence again, knowing each penny carried the same worth. The impact was immediate. Markets bustled. Taxes flowed predictably. The treasury strengthened. And with it came the resources to build boroughs, fund armies, and support the church. Short lines, firm trust, a kingdom stabilizing. This was Alfred's deeper brilliance. He saw every reform as part of one system. Defense, law, learning, and trade each depended on the others. Without economic stability, all of it could collapse back into chaos. But with it, Wessex could rise stronger than ever. Peace meant nothing without vigilance. Alfred knew it. The Vikings had vanished before, only to return without warning. Along the coast, scouts scanned the horizon for unfamiliar sails. Footsteps crunched over sand and cliffside paths as riders carried messages between boroughs. Watchtowers stood silent and ready, their guards gripping spears as dawn light cut across the fields. At the first sign of danger, signals flashed from one town to the next. Horns sounded. Gates slammed shut. Citizens hurried behind walls while soldiers took their positions. This was Alfred's design. A defense built on coordination rather than command, speed rather than size. A network of communities acting as one. Wessex was no longer waiting to be rescued. It was ready, alert, disciplined, and united against whatever threat rose from the sea. At first, the burghs were simply fortresses, raw earthworks, timber walls, and the smell of fresh-cut wood. But something began to change inside those defenses. Markets opened where soldiers once drilled. Smiths hammered iron in makeshift forges. Bakers lit their ovens. Children ran through streets that hadn't existed a year before. Families who had fled Viking raids settled again, building homes beside the walls meant to protect them. Life returned. Trade revived. And slowly, these fortified refuges transformed into living towns, beacons of stability in a kingdom that had nearly been erased. Many of these burghs would one day become the great cities of England. Alfred never planned to spark urbanization, but he did. In a land of scattered farms and frightened villages, he planted the idea of community behind walls, and that idea reshaped a nation's future. Alfred's reign stood apart because he mastered something rare in the medieval world: balance. Most kings lived by the sword alone. They left learning to monks, administration to nobles, and hoped brute force would hold their kingdoms together. Alfred saw further. By day, he inspected defenses, drilled troops, and studied enemy tactics. By night, he sat over manuscripts with scholars, translating wisdom line by candlelight. Ink on his fingers, a sword at his side, two halves of one purpose. He believed a kingdom could not survive on fear or force. Defense needed confidence. Confidence needed culture. And culture, living, shared, enduring, needed knowledge. This chain of understanding made Alfred extraordinary. While others fought for the present, he planned for a future no one else could yet see. He wasn't just saving Wessex. He was building England in the dark. Alfred's victories did not erase the Viking presence. The Danelaw still stretched across eastern England, a vast, shifting frontier where Norse settlers plowed new fields, traded in crowded markets, and lived in towns that echoed with both Old Norse and Old English. Longhouses stood beside Anglo-Saxon halls, customs blended, languages mingled. But beneath that surface harmony, loyalties remained divided. Alfred knew this landscape was not peaceful, it was precarious. One feud, one broken treaty, one ambitious warlord could snap the fragile balance. Coexistence demanded rules, boundaries, and constant attention. So Alfred managed the frontier like a wound that could reopen at any moment, carefully, deliberately, never complacent. For now, the uneasy peace held, not because the two worlds trusted each other, but because Alfred's vigilance made collapse too costly to risk. Inside Wessex, Alfred's leadership inspired a rare kind of loyalty. He ruled not through fear or spectacle, but through attention, through the quiet power of listening when other kings demanded obedience, through discussion when others barked orders. Contemporary writings describe him as patient, reflective, steady even when the kingdom seemed ready to collapse around him. But Alfred's faith ran deeper than personal devotion. It shaped every decision he made. To him, Wessex had been spared for a purpose, and rebuilding it was not just strategy, it was sacred duty. Justice, learning, peace. These were not conveniences for calmer times, but responsibilities placed on him by God. In Alfred's mind, a ruler failed not only by losing battles. He failed when he neglected the soul of his people, when he let ignorance fester, when he allowed injustice to take root, when he allowed a kingdom to survive without giving it something worth surviving for. Despite his victories, Alfred's fiercest enemy was the one no sword could touch. Pain, sharp, sudden, and merciless, pursued him throughout his life. At times it came like a thief in the night. At others it struck in the middle of council, turning his vision to haze and his breath to fire. Witnesses described him gripping the edge of his chair, knuckles white, willing himself to stay upright as generals debated strategy. Some mornings he woke drenched in sweat, unable to rise. Yet by noon he was at the training fields, forcing his body to obey him. Every decision, every reform, every campaign was made not from a place of effortless strength, but through a fog of relentless suffering. And this is what made Alfred truly extraordinary. He did not rule like a carved statue of a king, flawless, unmoved, untouchable. He ruled as a human being, frail in body yet unbreakable in resolve. His illness threatened the kingdom's stability, his leadership, even the morale of his people. But Alfred's answer was always the same: work harder, think clearer, endure longer. The greatness in Alfred the Great was not born of perfection. It was born of perseverance. Family was not a formality in Alfred's world. It was the engine of his long-term strategy. In the dim light of the royal hall, his children grew up not among idle luxury, but among scrolls, weapons, and whispered plans for a future their father feared he might not live to see. They studied Latin by candlelight, practiced diplomacy at the dinner table, and watched their father wrestle with pain as he shaped a kingdom out of chaos. Ethelfled, especially, absorbed everything. What began as a young princess observing her father's struggle became a woman forged for war. She would rise to command armies, fortify cities, and stand as the iron shield of Mercia, a shock to every chronicler who expected kings, not daughters, to define the age. Edward, her brother, learned a different form of power: administration, negotiation, and the patient consolidation of Wessex's growing influence. In Alfred's household, leadership was not inherited like a crown. It was drilled, tested, and earned. Every lesson, every story, every late-night discussion was an investment in a future Alfred could only imagine. And when that future arrived, it was his children who carried England closer to unity, living proof that Alfred's legacy was not just fought on battlefields, but nurtured around his own family table. As the 880s drew to a close, something profound began to shift across the map of Britain. Mercia, once the mighty heart of Anglo-Saxon power, was a kingdom bruised, diminished, and standing at a crossroads. Across its borders, Viking armies still prowled. Its great towns, once symbols of dominance, now depended on fragile defenses and fragile leadership. Into this uncertainty stepped Alfred of Wessex. What emerged was not conquest, but a partnership born of necessity. Wessex and Mercia, two battered realms, closed ranks, their survival intertwined. For centuries they had been rivals. Now they leaned on one another like soldiers bracing against a storm. Markets reopened under shared protection. Border forts were repaired by joint effort. Councils that once bristled with suspicion now spoke with one voice. This alliance mattered because the stakes were nothing less than the future of the island. If Mercia fell, Wessex would stand alone. If Wessex faltered, Mercia would be overrun. Together, they formed a shield strong enough to blunt the Viking advance. And yet the greatest change was invisible on any battlefield. Wessex had become the steady hand, the anchor of political power. Mercia, once dominant, now looked south for stability. The unification of England was still generations away. But in these years, in this unlikely partnership, the foundations were laid. A fractured land was learning, for the first time, what it meant to act as one. Yet beneath the calm surface, tensions simmered like embers waiting for a spark. The Danelaw was no single kingdom. It was a patchwork of rival warlords, each with their own loyalties, grudges, and ambitions. Some wanted farmland and quiet. Others dreamed of new plunder. And a few watched Wessex the way predators watch wounded prey, studying every sign of weakness. Alfred understood how quickly the fragile balance could unravel. His spies slipped across borders under moonlight, trading coins and coded phrases for scraps of information. Scouts monitored the rivers where Viking ships might appear without warning. In Winchester, council fires burned late into the night as messengers arrived breathless, carrying news of shifting alliances, feuds between Danish leaders, or ominous movements along the frontier. Peace existed, but only in the way a thin sheet of ice covers deep water. One reckless warlord, one failed negotiation, one misread signal could break it instantly. And so Wessex lived in a state of relentless readiness, weapons oiled, defenses stocked, eyes fixed on the horizon. Everyone knew the truth: the next storm was coming. The only question was when and from which direction. Alfred's fledgling navy soon found itself in a series of sharp, urgent clashes along the coast. These weren't sweeping armadas or epic sea duels. They were fast, brutal encounters in churning water, where a handful of ships determined whether raiders slipped ashore or were driven back into the waves. Spray lashed against wooden hulls. Oars hammered the water. Archers braced themselves as Viking prows burst from morning fog. Sometimes Alfred's new designs outmaneuvered their foes. Other times they caught too much wind or ran too deep, exposing the limits of untested innovation. But every skirmish carried the same unmistakable message. Wessex was no longer waiting helplessly on the shore. Alfred was attempting something no Anglo-Saxon king had ever tried: reshaping his kingdom into a maritime power. These hybrid ships, part West Saxon ingenuity and part borrowed Viking design, were the first steps of a navy that would outlive him by centuries. They were crude, imperfect, experimental, but they changed everything. For the first time, England's survival was being fought not just on land but on the sea, and Alfred had opened that door himself. In the late 880s and early 890s, the Vikings came again, quiet at first, then bold, probing the southern coast for weakness. Longships slipped across the channel under moonless skies. Raiders moved fast, expecting panic, expecting the same fractured resistance they had met years before. They found something very different. Bars sounded their alarms. Gates slammed shut. Archers lined the walls as garrisons sprinted into position. Smoke from warning beacons curled into the night, carrying news from one fortified town to the next. Villagers hurried inside the walls, not in chaos, but in practiced formation, every person knowing exactly where to run, because Alfred had planned it that way. The Vikings struck hard. Wessex struck back harder. Instead of collapsing, the fortified network absorbed the blow. Each attack became a skirmish, each skirmish a retreat. Alfred's reforms, his walls, his watches, his training, were no longer theories. They were working minute by minute, life by life. The kingdom that had once stood on the edge of annihilation was now a machine of coordinated defense. Wessex was no longer reacting to danger. It was outthinking it. When Alfred's forces met the Vikings in open battle, the difference was immediate. Lines that once broke now held. Units advanced and withdrew with practiced discipline. Orders cut through the chaos as runners sprinted along the improved roads, carrying commands from bar to battlefield with astonishing speed. You can almost see it: shields locking in the morning fog, formations shifting as one, weary soldiers drawing strength from the system that surrounded them. Every watchtower that spotted an enemy movement, every garrison drilled into readiness, every fortified town standing firm behind them, it all fed into this moment. The Vikings fought fiercely, but Wessex fought intelligently. What had been a desperate struggle for survival only a decade earlier was now a coordinated machine of defense and counterattack. Each clash wasn't just a victory. It was proof that Alfred's design worked. A kingdom that had once teetered on the brink was learning how to endure, long enough to build something far greater than survival. When a Viking warband pushed deep into Wessex and dug in behind hastily built earthworks, the threat was immediate and lethal. If the camp held, it could become a new base of operations, a spark that might reignite the terror of earlier decades. Alfred didn't hesitate. From the nearest bars, detachments marched out at dawn, shields polished with dew, faces drawn tight with determination. Runners carried orders along the king's new roads, their footfalls echoing across bridges and valleys. Within hours, West Saxon forces converged from every direction, sealing the Vikings inside their crude fort. Rain soaked the earth. Fires sputtered. Food ran short. Inside the camp, the invaders, once feared across the sea, felt hunger gnawing at them. Tempers flared. Night watches stretched into exhaustion. Every day the circle around them tightened. Every night the cries of the wounded grew louder. At last, with their strength fading and their gambit collapsing, the Vikings broke. They slipped away under cover of darkness, abandoning the camp they had fought so fiercely to hold. It wasn't merely a victory. It was a revelation. Wessex no longer lived at the mercy of invaders. It commanded the battlefield. It dictated the future. And under Alfred's lead, its enemies were now the ones running for survival. By the early 890s, Alfred's reputation had crossed the sea like a steady, guiding light. In an age defined by fire and uncertainty, he was seen as something rare, a ruler who brought order rather than chaos. Scholars arrived at his court carrying manuscripts wrapped in linen, eager to join the intellectual revival taking shape in Wessex. Merchants moved along newly secured roads, their carts heavy with goods, their journeys no longer shadowed by fear. In the royal halls, legal disputes were settled with a consistency unimaginable a generation earlier. Justice felt tangible, something people could trust. This was the same kingdom that had once crouched on the edge of ruin, praying merely to survive the next season. Now it stood as a pillar of stability, watched with respect by rulers across the channel. And Alfred had done it without expanding his borders, without chasing glory, without ruling through terror. He built strength from the inside out, brick by brick, law by law, reform by reform. A quiet revolution of governance and learning that reshaped Wessex into a realm meant to outlast its king and its enemies. Even at the height of his power, Alfred stayed rooted in something far more modest than ambition. In quiet moments, he wrote by candlelight, ink scratching across parchment as he measured his own choices with brutal honesty. Advisors recalled a king who listened more than he spoke, who questioned himself more than he questioned others. His writings never boast. They linger on duty, on the burden of leadership, on the fear of failing the people who depended on him. He admitted doubt in an age when rulers wrapped themselves in divine certainty. That vulnerability was unheard of, and it made him human in a time when kings tried desperately not to be. This humility didn't weaken him. It strengthened the trust others placed in him. It shaped every reform, every law, every defense he built. And it planted the seeds of a legacy that would stretch far beyond his lifetime, rooted not in conquest but in character. A legacy England would remember long after Alfred's battles, his burrs, and even his kingdom had passed into history. Alfred understood that swords alone couldn't save a kingdom. Survival demanded knowledge, quiet, hidden, dangerous knowledge. So while he lived among the marshes, he built something revolutionary, an intelligence web stretching across Wessex. Scouts moved like shadows through thick forests. Couriers rode at night, cloaks pulled tight, carrying coded messages no Viking could decipher. Local leaders held secret meetings in barns and back rooms, trading rumors of incoming fleets, shifting alliances, and hostile movements along the borders. Every report carried risk. One captured scout, one careless word, and the entire network could unravel, exposing villages, burrs, even Alfred himself. Yet the system held, because Alfred cultivated it carefully, linking loyalty to survival and survival to hope. And as the storm of invasion drew closer, these whispers became weapons. Information became strategy, and Wessex, against all odds, began to prepare for the fight of its life. By early 878, Wessex stood on the brink of extinction. Guthrum's forces held its towns like a tightening fist. Smoke drifted from abandoned homesteads. Frozen fields lay stripped and trampled. Roads that once carried trade now carried only refugees, tired, hungry, and terrified. Villages were silent. Churches stood cold and hollow, their bells stilled, their altars deserted. Every mile of countryside whispered the same truth. The kingdom had been broken. Guthrum looked unstoppable. His armies moved with confidence, with coordination, with the terrifying ease of men who believed victory was already theirs. And yet, Alfred did not yield. In the heart of this devastation, the king's resolve hardened. He saw not ruins but responsibilities, not defeat but a future still worth fighting for. Wessex might have fallen to its knees, but Alfred refused to let it die. Against impossible odds, he steeled himself for the struggle ahead, one that would demand everything he had left. One bleak winter evening, Alfred, a thane trusted enough to risk everything, picked his way through the marshes. Cold mud clung to his boots, mist coiled around his ankles. Every rustle in the reeds sounded like a blade being drawn. By the time he reached Alfred's hidden camp, his cloak was soaked, his breath shaking, his mind racing with what he had learned. Guthrum was mobilizing, not a raid, an annihilating blow. A coordinated strike meant to sweep the last sparks of Wessex resistance into the mud and finish the kingdom for good. Alfred delivered the news in a whisper. The camp fell silent. Only the wind moved. Alfred did not. He sat still, lantern light flickering across his face, listening with a calm that bordered on eerie. He asked questions short, sharp, exact, cutting through panic with surgical precision. As Alfred spoke, the king's expression didn't darken. It brightened. Because buried inside the danger was what Alfred had been waiting for: certainty, direction. A single, clear moment when the enemy revealed his hand. At last the storm was coming into focus, and Alfred, tired, hunted, half-starved, felt ready to meet it. While other rulers obsessed over the next battle, Alfred was sketching the future. By firelight, he traced plans across rough parchment, lines for new burghs, arrows for trade routes, dots for garrisons. At dawn, he rode through ruined fields, imagining them reborn. In council halls, he spoke quietly with advisors about coinage, justice, and the power of learning. He wasn't dreaming of luxuries. He was designing survival. Fortified towns rising like a chain of shields across the kingdom, roads binding them together, markets that could feed armies, a law code that protected the weak and restrained the powerful, schools where young minds learned not just to fight, but to understand the world they were inheriting. It was radical, almost unheard of in the 9th century, but Alfred knew that swords alone could not save Wessex. A kingdom needed structure. It needed knowledge. It needed hope. And in the darkest years of the Viking Wars, Alfred dared to build not just for the present battle, but for a future his people could still believe in. Word traveled in murmurs carried from hearth to hearth. The king lives, the king is preparing. No shouts, no open celebration, just quiet, trembling hope. Supporters moved only at night, lanterns hooded. Footsteps softened by mud and frost. They slipped past Viking patrols, passing messages in barns, under church eaves, behind shuttered windows. One wrong word, one careless noise, and entire families could vanish. But still, they moved. Hidden weapons were unearthed from beneath floorboards. Grain was stored in secret pits. Lookouts watched river crossings for friendly signals. What had been scattered, frightened survivors slowly began to knit together into something new. A network of determination, a pulse, a heartbeat. Wessex was no longer dying. It was gathering strength in the shadows, waiting for the moment to rise. To summon his scattered followers, Alfred turned to an ancient weapon: fire on the hills. One spark, one tower, then another. Flames roared to life on the ridge lines, leaping from hilltop to hilltop in a chain of burning signals. Valleys flickered with orange light. Forest shadows twisted as riders galloped beneath the glow, carrying the king's message into the dark. These beacons were no legend. They were lifelines. If even one failed to ignite, entire regions could be lost before help arrived. The Vikings would strike unopposed. Wessex could fall. But Alfred had planned for this moment. He knew the land, every slope, every vantage, every place where a watchman could stand and be seen for miles. And as the night burned with answering flames, his kingdom awakened. Farmers, thanes, hidden fighters emerging from silence. Wessex was no longer waiting for rescue. It was moving, because Alfred had lit the sky. Hidden deep in the marshlands, far from Viking patrols, Alfred drilled his men without mercy. Mud sucked at their boots. Cold wind tore across the reeds. The clang of shields echoed through the mist like distant thunder. They trained in the tactic the Vikings had mastered, the shield wall, not strength discipline, not fury precision. Shields slammed together, edges grinding. Lines tightened until no blade could slip through. Step, halt, brace, absorb the blow, again. And again. Alfred walked the line, silent and watchful. He corrected stances with a tap, adjusted grips with a glance. His men felt the change in him. He was leaner, sharper, hardened by exile and loss. Every drill carved away weakness. Every clash of wood and iron forged resolve. Here, in the cold and mud, Wessex was being remade, by a king preparing for the fight of his life. Alfred's strategy hinged on one principle: strike once, strike hard, strike where the enemy least expects it. He refused to scatter his strength across undefendable villages. Instead, he would gather it quietly, invisibly, into one decisive force. By torchlight, he studied crude maps on the marsh floor. He traced river bends with his finger, marked narrow forest trails with a dagger tip, and tapped the ridgelines that offered high ground. Scouts drifted in and out of the darkness, murmuring updates about Viking patrols, campfires, and weak points in their lines. Guthrum believed Alfred was cornered, that Wessex was broken. He had no idea how thin his own forces were stretched. One mistake in timing could doom the kingdom. One miscalculation could leave Alfred's army exposed. But if the plan worked, a single, coordinated strike could rip the heart out of the Viking advance. Every breath, every whisper, every drawn line on Alfred's map carried the weight of Wessex's fate. Midnight rides threaded through the forests, soft hoofbeats, cloaked riders, torches shuddered against the dark. Messengers moved like ghosts between abandoned villages, carrying Alfred's summons. One by one, regional leaders emerged from hiding. Some returned out of duty, others out of guilt, all out of hope. They came at great risk. Viking patrols prowled the roads. A single mistake meant capture or death, but still they came. Alfred received each man without hesitation. No accusations, no pride, only purpose. Every rider who stepped forward made Wessex feel a little less broken, its scattered pieces gathering, its spirit rising, its king at the center, quietly drawing the kingdom back to life. Wessex was no longer crumbling. It was reforming. It was waking. At first light, a thin column of smoke curled into the sky, then another, and another. Hilltops ignited in sequence, flickering flames casting long shadows as the beacons of Wessex roared awake. This was Alfred's signal, his design, his moment. Across the fields and forests, watchers saw the rising plumes and froze. Farmers let tools fall into the earth. Shepherds turned from their grazing flocks. Men who had waited in uncertainty felt their hearts jolt. The king had called, and the kingdom answered. But with each beacon came risk. If Viking scouts saw the pattern before the fiat assembled, all could be lost. Every second mattered. Still the roads filled, quietly at first, then with a growing, determined roar. Villages stirred. Towns shook off their fear. What had been a scattered, broken land was now rising in firelight and resolve. Wessex was no longer hiding. It was moving, it was gathering, it was awakening to war. In the heart of Somerset they gathered, first hundreds, then thousands. Footsteps thudded through the mist. Armor clattered. Spears knocked together in restless hands. Banners snapped in the cold morning air. Men from shattered villages. Veterans hardened by loss. Farmers who had never marched this far. All bound by a single conviction: Wessex must live. Alfred stepped before them, not high on a throne, but standing in the same wet grass, the same rising dawn. He looked like one of them, a man who had felt the same terror, the same grief, and refused to let it define him. His voice rose through the quiet, steady, controlled, certain. This was not a plea, not a gamble. It was a promise that their suffering would forge the force that would strike back. The crowd tightened, men falling into ranks, finding rhythm and discipline. What had been a scattered people was becoming an army, one breath, one shield, one purpose. The counterattack had begun. Alfred's army moved in silence, threading through ancient woodland tracks to avoid Viking eyes. Forest shadows stretched long in the early light. Dawn speared through branches in thin, cold beams. Mist clung to boots. Armor creaked. The soft rhythm of marching feet rolled beneath the trees. Every sound mattered. A snapped twig could give them away. Viking patrols roamed nearby. One mistake, and the dream of Wessex could vanish in an instant. Scouts darted ahead ghost-like, returning with whispers of river crossings, high ridges, and enemy movement. The men pressed on, marching at dawn, resting at midday, moving again as the sun bled into evening. Every mile hardened them. Every hour tightened discipline. Determination settled into their bones. And Alfred was there, walking among his soldiers, sharing the mud, the sweat, the fear. A king not carried by his army but marching at its heart. Wessex was no longer running. Wessex was advancing. Meanwhile, Guthrum felt untouchable. His scouts mentioned unusual movement in the countryside, but he waved it off. Ragged locals, scattered survivors, nothing worth concern. In his mind, Alfred was still broken, starving, hiding in marshland shadows. Across the captured towns, Viking camps sprawled lazily. Warriors lounged by fires. Weapons lay propped against walls. Guards kept watch but without urgency. Months of easy conquest had dulled their edge. Guthrum rode through these settlements with calm assurance. Smoke drifted from longhouses. Laughter echoed over stolen fields. Everything told him the same story. Wessex was finished. But small signs whispered otherwise. Footprints where none should be, distant torchlight on unfamiliar hills, a scout returning pale and uncertain. Guthrum ignored them. And that was his mistake. He had misread Alfred. Misread a king capable of forging unity from ruin, of turning despair into fury, and striking with precision when the enemy least expected it. The reckoning was already moving toward him. Alfred reached the high ridge above Eddington just as the sun slipped behind the hills. The last light bled across the landscape, turning Viking tents into long, dark silhouettes. Spears glinted faintly, smoke drifted from cookfires. Below, the enemy rested unaware, unprepared. Alfred stood still, reading the land like a map. Narrow approaches, broken ground, slopes that favored defense. From here, his men could see everything. From below, the Vikings would see almost nothing. If the shield wall held, Guthrum wouldn't break it. Not here, not on this ground. Alfred called his commanders close. No wasted words. A dawn assault. Full force. No hesitation. Push until the line cracked, then drive the enemy down the hill. Around him, his soldiers waited in tense silence. Hearts pounding. Fingers on shield rims and spear shafts. They knew what sunrise meant. This was the moment Wessex had been marching toward. The moment everything would hinge upon. Night wrapped itself around the ridge as Wessex prepared. Shields thudded as men tested their grip. Spearheads rasped against whetstones. Bowstrings creaked in the cold air. Torchlight flickered across anxious eyes and armor worn thin by months of war. Some soldiers knelt in the grass, whispering prayers. Others sat motionless, staring into the dark, seeing not the fields below, but the ruins of their homes, the faces of loved ones taken by the Vikings. Alfred walked among them, a steady figure in the shifting firelight. He gave no grand speeches, no false comfort, just a quiet certainty: this fight must be met and we will meet it together. The stakes were absolute. If they failed at dawn, Wessex would not rise again. Yet beneath the fear, something stronger took hold. A slow, burning resolve. A defiance that tightened jaws and steeled hearts. Tonight, hope was not spoken. It was forged, like a blade, sharp, cold, and ready for the coming storm. Dawn broke slowly, a pale light bleeding through the mist. Cold air clung to armor. Frosted grass crunched beneath boots as Alfred's men stepped into formation, their shield wall stretching across the ridge like a living rampart. Down in the valley, the Viking camp stirred. A few groggy warriors looked up, froze, then shouted in alarm. Others stumbled from tents, grabbing axes, slamming on helmets, confusion rippling through their ranks like a shockwave. Above them, Alfred stood motionless, calm, focused. His breath hung in the morning air. With a steady, deliberate motion, he lifted his sword, not for show, but as a signal precise and inevitable. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Two armies, one rising sun, one kingdom on the brink. The next hours would decide everything: Wessex, its people, and the future of England itself. The armies slammed together with a deafening crack, wood against wood, iron against bone. The shield walls ground forward, shields splintering, spears snapping in men's hands. Sweat, mud, and blood mixed into the choking dust. The air reeked of iron and fear. Fighting this close was suffocating. Faces pressed inches apart. Warriors roared, strained, gasped for breath as blades stabbed through the narrow gaps between shields. The line trembled, bent, held. The Vikings surged again, a brutal heave that rattled the entire formation. Then Wessex pushed back, boots digging into the earth, teeth clenched, shoulders locked. The struggle shifted by inches, forward, backward, forward again, each movement paid for in flesh. Through it all, Alfred watched the line with razor focus. He called out orders, steady and controlled: tighten here, brace there, hold the center, press the flank. His presence steadied the men. His voice cut through the chaos like a lifeline. This was more than a battle. It was survival of their homes, their families, their kingdom. Wessex fought with everything it had left. Alfred saw it: the hesitation in the Viking line, the wavering shields, the staggered breaths. He seized the moment. Forward, the English surged in perfect unison. Shields locked, spears darted. Boots pounded the earth in a single, rolling advance. Every movement was controlled, disciplined. The marshland drills now unleashed with lethal precision. Metal clashed, shields buckled, dust burst upward with each violent collision. Sweat stung eyes. Voices rose, Alfred's above them all. He rode the front, shouting commands, tightening the formation where it bowed, driving it forward where it held. He was not merely leading the army. He was shaping it moment by moment into an unstoppable force. Across from them, the Vikings fought hard, but disorder crept in. Gaps opened. Commands muddled. Some warriors pushed forward while others pulled back, their cohesion unraveling under the relentless pressure. Momentum shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Wessex was advancing, and the tide of battle had begun to turn. Guthrum saw it: the tightening English line, the growing cracks in his own. He barked orders, sending his elite warriors crashing forward in a desperate charge. Arrows hissed overhead. Spears clattered against shields. Dust exploded beneath racing feet. The Vikings hit hard, but Wessex didn't break. The English line absorbed the blow, locked tight, then pushed back with cold, disciplined force. Every step drove the invaders deeper into chaos. Alfred's banner rose above the shield wall, catching the morning light, a single, steady beacon amid the storm. Viking eyes fixed on it. Fear crept in. Men slipped on blood-slick grass. Others stumbled over bodies, scrambling to find footing as the English advanced. Shouts warped into frantic cries. Orders dissolved into noise. Guthrum felt it like a blow to the chest. Control slipping, momentum lost, the battle sliding away. For the first time, the shadow of true defeat fell across the Viking camp, and he knew there was no pulling it back. Minutes dragged like hours. Shields shook under blows, armor rang. Breath came in ragged bursts. The field echoed with screams, clashing steel, and the dull thud of bodies hitting the earth. Then a crack in the Viking line, a shudder, a buckle. Alfred saw it instantly. He surged forward, shouting orders over the roar of battle. His men responded like a single living force, driving into the gap with brutal precision. Shields slammed forward. Spears punched through armor. The formation split. The Vikings panicked. Some fell back, others ran. The line didn't bend, it collapsed, folding in on itself as shouts turned to screams and flight overtook fury. Wessex surged. The shield wall advanced. For a heartbeat, even Alfred's soldiers hesitated, shocked that the impossible was happening before their eyes. And then a wave of fierce, exhausted relief swept through them. Alfred had broken the army that once seemed invincible. The terror of Wessex was in full retreat. The kingdom had not only survived, it had risen. The Viking line shattered. What had been a solid wall of shields dissolved into chaos. Guthrum's warriors turned and ran for Chippenham, once fierce, now frantic. Dust surged into the air, hanging thick and choking. Abandoned spears rolled under fleeing boots. Splintered shields lay cracked in the dirt. Alfred did not chase. He commanded order, discipline. Hold the line, advance together. English soldiers tightened formation, shields shifting into place with dull, heavy thuds. Armor clattered as they moved, measured steps, unbroken ranks. Banners flapped in the rising wind, their colors slicing through the dust-filled haze. Ahead, Vikings screamed orders, some fleeing, others spinning back in desperate clusters, trying to rally. Panic rippled through their lines, but panic made them unpredictable, dangerous. The English pressed forward, not fast, not reckless, just steady, inevitable. Every step echoed the same message: Wessex is coming. Wessex will not stop. Guthrum wasn't defeated yet, but Alfred was closing the door around him. And this time, there would be no escape. The pursuit swept across rolling hills and through tightening forest paths. Dust rose with every step, clinging to armor, stinging eyes. The smell of trampled earth and distant smoke drifted on the wind, signs of the Vikings' frantic retreat. English scouts sprinted ahead, silhouetted against the afternoon light, signaling back with raised spears and sharp cries. Each gesture redrew the battlefield in Alfred's mind. Abandoned wagons lay tilted in ditches. Spilled grain glimmered in the dirt. Axes, cloaks, even half-empty chests were discarded in panic. Each object told the same story. Guthrum's army was falling apart. Morale surged. Soldiers murmured to each other, gripping their spears tighter. Hope, real, solid hope, coursed through the ranks like a fresh breath of air. Alfred rode along the line, scanning the ridges and tree lines for any sign of an ambush. His voice cut through the marching rhythm, steady, controlled, reminding his men to stay tight, stay alert. The Vikings were desperate, and desperation could make them deadly. Step by step, mile by mile, the English advanced. They were not just following their king. They were reclaiming their land, taking back every field, every path, every breath of Wessex stolen from them. By evening, Alfred's army reached Chippenham. Smoke drifted in thin, ghostly trails from abandoned cookfires. From behind rough barricades came the muffled clatter of shields, the low rumble of shouted Viking orders, fear wrapped in defiance. The Danes had sealed themselves in hastily. Timber, wagons, and earth were piled into makeshift walls, crude, uneven, enough to stall an assault, but never to stop one. Alfred studied every angle. He rode the perimeter slowly, torchlight flickering across his armor, his gaze sharp and measuring. He spotted weaknesses, gaps in the wall, sagging beams, places where panic had replaced craftsmanship. He nodded to his captains, issuing quiet, crisp commands: encircle them, every path, every doorway, every possible escape. English soldiers fanned out, forming a tightening ring around Chippenham. Shields glinted in the firelight. Boots thudded softly in the dirt. The night filled with the rustle of movement and the crackle of torches planted in the earth. Inside the barricades, the Vikings felt the noose closing. Hunger crept in. Smoke stung their eyes. Every shout echoed louder in the shrinking space. Uncertainty spread like a cold draft between men who once charged without fear. Alfred stood at the center of his encamped forces, calm and resolute. This siege was not built for months, it was built for breaking, and he knew the pressure would do its work. Victory was no longer a question, only time. Inside Chippenham, the air hung heavy, thick with smoke, sweat, and the sour stench of unwashed bodies pressed into failing defenses. Wind hissed through gaps in the crude barricades. Armor clattered as exhausted Vikings shifted, shivered, argued. Wounded men groaned in the shadows. Some called for water. Others simply whispered prayers. Hunger dug its claws deeper with each passing hour. Guthrum stalked the cramped pathways, barking orders, trying to ignite fading courage. But his voice rang hollow. Every command echoed back at him, unanswered, swallowed by dread. His messengers sent to call for reinforcements never returned. Alfred's encirclement held firm, silent, and absolute. Restless warriors muttered among themselves. A few argued for a desperate breakout. Others, eyes sunken and tired, murmured of surrender. Even the fiercest among them felt doubt gnawing at the edges of their resolve. Guthrum clenched his jaw as realization settled like iron in his chest. Alfred was winning without lifting a sword. His enemy moved like a shadow, shaping their fate from beyond the barricades. Every hour tightened the noose. Every whisper eroded hope. For the first time, the great warlord feared the inevitable. After days of tightening pressure, a lone rider approached Chippenham at dusk. Hooves thudded against the earth. Torches flickered along Alfred's lines as guards shifted, hands on spear shafts, watching every move. The messenger rode straight to the gate. No hesitation, no fear. In his grip, Alfred's ultimatum. Inside, Vikings crowded around as the parchment was unrolled. The crackle of fire seemed to pause. "Surrender," it read. "Accept peace on Wessex's terms and live." Whispers rippled through the fortress. Men exchanged glances, fear and pride wrestling in their eyes. Armor clinked. Someone exhaled sharply. Another muttered a prayer. Guthrum read the message twice. His gaze moved across his battered warriors, faces gaunt from hunger, bodies bruised from battle, spirits worn thin. He felt the weight of their hope and their despair. Alfred's presence hung over the camp like a shadow, unseen, unwavering, inescapable. This was no offer of weakness. It was a calculated move, mercy as strategy, peace as power. Total destruction would only breed new enemies. Submission could reshape a kingdom. The choice cut like a blade: fight and die. Surrender and live under Alfred's rule. There was no escaping it now. The reckoning had arrived. Inside the battered fortifications of Chippenham, Guthrum paced in slow, heavy steps. The timber walls groaned in the wind. His boots scraped across dirt trampled by days of fear. His fingers drummed against the hilt of his sword, once a symbol of conquest, now a reminder of how far he had fallen. Around him, warriors slumped against shields, hollow-eyed and starving. The air smelled of damp wood, stale smoke, and despair. Murmurs drifted through the darkness, frustration, fear, arguments hushed as Guthrum passed. He paused, looked at them, really looked. These were men who had crossed seas for glory, now reduced to shadows. Pride screamed at him to fight to the death, to break out, to burn everything, to go down in a blaze of fury. But reason whispered a colder truth. One more clash would destroy what remained of his people. A long silence stretched. Then Guthrum exhaled, a low, shuddering breath, shoulders sagging. The decision he had once sworn never to make now settled on him like a weight far heavier than armor. He summoned a messenger. "Tell Alfred," Guthrum said, voice rough, barely above a whisper, "we accept his terms." With that single sentence, the warlord who had once seemed unstoppable acknowledged defeat, not just in battle, but in strategy, in will, in vision. Alfred had won. Not through rage or brutality, but through discipline, unity, patience, and an unbreakable plan. Wessex would survive, and history would remember this moment. Weeks after Edington, under a pale morning sky, Guthrum stepped into the cold waters at Aller. Mist curled low over the river. Torches flickered along the banks despite the daylight, their smoke drifting like incense. Clerics in white robes chanted softly, voices echoing across the marshes. English soldiers and Viking survivors stood side by side, silent, tense, witnessing a moment none could have imagined months earlier. Alfred watched from the water's edge, calm, composed, every detail under his control. This was not just mercy, it was strategy. It was statecraft shaped in ritual. Guthrum knelt. The bishop poured water over his bowed head. A short, sharp breath escaped him, the cold biting deep. The chants rose, a symbol of defeat and rebirth. When Guthrum emerged, dripping and shivering, he was no longer simply a warlord. He was a baptized Christian, a sworn ally, a leader bound by oath and faith to Alfred's peace. For the English, it felt like divine victory. For Alfred, it was something even greater, a political triumph sealed by the hand of God and witnessed by all who would shape England's future. In the weeks that followed, peace took shape, not in the clash of shields, but in quiet negotiations on neutral ground. Beneath a canvas pavilion, emissaries from Wessex and Guthrum's newly Christian court unfolded maps across a wooden table. Wax seals, boundary markers, and carved stakes lay ready at hand. This was the making of what later chroniclers would call the Treaty of Wedmore. Lines were drawn with careful precision. Wessex secured its sovereignty. Guthrum's people gained the right to settle peacefully in East Anglia. Clerics, scribes, and soldiers watched from the edges, some hopeful, others wary, feeling the weight of every word spoken. Outside, the landscape bore scars of war, burned fields, abandoned outposts. Yet here, in measured voices and formal agreements, a different kind of power prevailed. Alfred understood the moment. Victory meant more than triumph on the battlefield. It meant shaping a future where stability could take root after years of chaos. With strategy, patience, and diplomacy as deliberate as any military campaign, he redrew the map of his world and laid the foundations for the England yet to come. Wessex had been scarred by war, charred villages, crumbling roads, empty markets. But under Alfred's steady hand, renewal swept across the land. Burghs rose like stone guardians along newly planned routes. Fresh-cut timber framed watchtowers. Market squares echoed with the calls of merchants and the rumble of carts heavy with goods. Families returned to rebuild shattered homes. Mothers swept ash from long-abandoned hearths. Children raced through streets where silence once ruled. Farmers plowed fields without fear of raiders emerging from the tree line. And Alfred was everywhere, riding the length of his kingdom, inspecting walls, speaking with craftsmen, encouraging priests, listening to farmers. His presence stitched Wessex back together, brick by brick, road by road, heart by heart. From the wreckage of invasion, a stronger kingdom emerged, safer, smarter, united in purpose. Wessex was not merely recovering, it was rising. Alfred's burgh system was nothing short of revolutionary. Each fortified town rose like an anchor of stability, part military base, part civic heartbeat. From above, the burghs formed a lattice across Wessex, linked by new roads and watchpoints. Animated lines could trace their connections, showing how no village now stood alone. Inside the walls, defenders drilled in sunlit courtyards. Craftsmen hammered repairs into shield frames. Supply wagons rolled through gatehouses, bringing grain, tools, and timber. And everywhere, ordinary people played their part. Every household had a duty. Some sent laborers to maintain the walls. Others provided food for the garrisons. Able-bodied men rotated through service, standing ready to repel any threat. This wasn't just a defense network, it was a national partnership. For the first time in generations, the people felt something powerful, confidence. Undefended hamlets that once fell to sudden raids now stood within marching distance of a fortress. The chaos of the past, burning villages, scrambling militias, desperate last stands, gave way to discipline, coordination, and calm readiness. Alfred wasn't simply preparing for the next battle. He was crafting a civilization designed to endure, a kingdom where strategy, community, and foresight formed the strongest shield of all. Alfred's victories had secured Wessex, but stability was only the beginning. With the kingdom finally breathing again, he set his sights on something even more ambitious, rebuilding the mind of England. For Alfred, literacy was not a luxury of monasteries, it was the backbone of wise rule. Yet decades of warfare had hollowed out the nation's learning. Libraries lay in ashes, scholars scattered, manuscripts lost to flame and chaos. Alfred called this decline a national wound. He gathered teachers, invited foreign scholars, and began translating essential works himself. In his eyes, knowledge was a fortress, one capable of defending a kingdom long after swords had dulled. Alfred established a school at his court, transforming the royal hall into a sanctuary of learning. Sunlight fell across long wooden tables where young nobles and Alfred's own children bent over precious manuscripts. Scholars from across Britain and the continent guided them, voices shifting between Latin and Old English as lessons in scripture, arithmetic, and philosophy unfolded. Students who once knew only the sword now grappled with ideas, their awe visible in every careful stroke of ink. In an age when many rulers governed by instinct alone, Alfred was forging a generation shaped by knowledge, discipline, and thoughtful judgment, the minds that would one day guide England's future. Alfred didn't just command, he wrote. In the quiet hours before dawn, he sat at a heavy wooden desk, candles flickering over open manuscripts. Latin lines flowed beneath his fingers, transformed into clear, elegant English. Pastoral care, the consolation of philosophy, works that once belonged only to scholars now reached reeves, priests, and young nobles. This was more than scholarship, it was statecraft. Every translated page strengthened the kingdom, giving officials the wisdom to govern and citizens the language to understand their world. For people long shut out of learning, it felt like stepping from darkness into light. Centuries before public education, Alfred was building the intellectual backbone of England. Alfred didn't merely enforce laws, he reinvented them. In candle-lit halls, scribes bent over parchment as Alfred dictated revisions, line by precise line. He blended ancient Anglo-Saxon customs with biblical principles and clear moral logic, shaping a code that ordinary people could trust. Across Wessex, village elders gathered to read these new laws aloud. Disputes once ruled by uncertainty now found resolution in clarity. Justice felt predictable, fair. Alfred even wrote personal prefaces, explaining why each rule mattered, revealing a ruler guided not just by authority, but by conscience. Under his reforms, Wessex transformed. Chaos gave way to order, fear gave way to confidence. The kingdom stood united under a shared moral vision. Peace didn't mean Alfred rested. The memory of Viking sails haunted every shoreline, every village. So he rebuilt the military from the ground up. In training fields across Wessex, horns sounded as the Field, the citizen army, mustered in disciplined rotations. No longer were farmers dragged from their fields for months at a time. Alfred created a three-part system, one force in active service, one guarding the burghs, and one tending the farms that sustained them all. Men moved seamlessly from plow to spear, from watchtower to training yard. It was a logistical masterpiece, quiet, efficient, revolutionary. While other kingdoms scrambled to respond to danger, Wessex lived in a state of constant readiness, its defenses humming like a well-tuned machine. Alfred understood a brutal truth: control of the seas meant control of survival. Viking raids rose from the waves without warning, swift, merciless, unstoppable. So Alfred struck at the source. Shipbuilders worked day and night, sparks flying as axes cut timber and ropes tightened freshly carved hulls. Alfred inspected the designs himself, longer than Viking ships, broader, more stable, built to carry larger crews and withstand rougher waters. Not every experiment succeeded, but each launch pushed Wessex closer to something revolutionary, the birth of an English navy. For the first time, hope traveled on the tides. These ships could intercept raiders before they reached the shore, shifting the balance of power at sea. Alfred wasn't just defending Wessex, he was redefining its future. Within just a few years, Alfred's burghs were no longer blueprints on parchment. They were thriving, fortified towns beating like a pulse across Wessex. Stone walls rose above the countryside. Gates creaked open at dawn for merchants. Markets filled with voices, bartering, laughter, and the clang of smiths shaping iron. Farmers brought grain. Artisans sold tools and textiles. Children ran through streets once scarred by fear. And always, the system watched. Messengers sprinted along Alfred's protected roads, carrying warnings from one burg to the next. Garrison drums echoed as defenders assembled on ramparts, ready to repel any sudden Viking raid. Wessex had become something new, coordinated, confident, resilient. Alfred had taken a kingdom battered by chaos and rebuilt it into a structure of order and strength, a living testament to vision forged in crisis. Alfred refused to rule from a distant throne. He rode through Wessex's burghs, crossed its farmlands, and walked its village streets. Markets paused as he approached. Farmers bowed with weary respect. Children stared in awe. He spoke with everyone, smiths shaping iron, merchants counting coin, soldiers sharpening spears. He listened. He learned. He noted every concern, a broken road, a shortage of grain, a weak section of wall. These were not ceremonial visits. They were the heartbeat of his governance. Alfred believed a kingdom could only be strong if its ruler understood everyday life, and his presence meant something profound. Their struggles were seen, their voices mattered, and the king who had saved Wessex still stood beside them, watchful even in peace, knowing threats, near or distant, could rise again. As stability returned, culture flowed back into Wessex like sunlight after a long storm. Poets gathered in great halls, their voices rising over firelight as they recited tales nearly lost to war. In quiet monasteries, monks bent over parchment, quills scratching in steady rhythm, preserving wisdom one careful stroke at a time. Villagers revived old festivals, dances, feasts, and rituals that blended ancient Anglo-Saxon customs with renewed Christian faith. Artisans carved intricate patterns into wood and silver. Children heard heroic stories for the first time, eyes wide with wonder. A monk smiled softly as he finished a manuscript he feared would never be rewritten. Alfred welcomed it all. He understood that stories, symbols, and shared memories were more than entertainment. They were the glue of a nation. After decades of fear and fragmentation, Wessex was rediscovering itself. The people could finally imagine a future shaped by identity, pride, and hope, not just the struggle to survive. The late 880s and early 890s brought something Wessex had not known in a generation. Peace. Real peace. Fields shimmered with golden grain, richer than before. Farmers worked from sunrise to dusk, their laughter echoing across open land once scarred by raiders. In coastal towns, ships unloaded goods from distant markets, salt, cloth, wine, reviving trade routes long abandoned. Merchants counted coins with cautious optimism. Children chased each other through sunlit villages, their games uninterrupted by fear. A soldier watched them with a quiet smile, grateful for a future he once thought impossible. But Alfred never eased his guard. He refined laws, calibrated taxes, and personally inspected burgh defenses. Monks opened newly copied manuscripts with reverence, while officials used Alfred's translations to govern wisely. These were not idle years. They were the years when foundations were laid, brick by brick, law by law, idea by idea, for the England that would one day emerge. Peace was not rest, it was construction. By the late 890s, Alfred had become more than the defender of Wessex. He was redefining what it meant to rule. He rebuilt schools to revive learning. He rewrote and clarified laws to unify his people. He strengthened administration through burghs, fortified towns that anchored a new national defense. He even launched England's first coordinated naval program to secure the coasts. Alfred believed kingship was a moral contract, to guide, educate, and protect. His reign shifted from desperate resistance to intentional state building, and the systems he forged endured because he crafted them with purpose, not chance. Historians call this moment the Alfredian Renaissance, a cultural revival in an age more often remembered for fire and war. Alfred feared that knowledge itself might vanish from England, so he invited scholars from Mercia, Wales, and across Europe to his court, men who traveled long roads to bring learning back to Wessex. In candlelit scriptoria, monks copied ancient texts. Royal translators worked beside Alfred himself, turning major Latin works into English so that even freeborn men with no classical training could read them. This wasn't charity or curiosity. It was strategy. A kingdom with educated clergy, informed administrators, and shared language was harder to divide and far stronger to govern. Knowledge became a tool of statecraft, and these translations would shape English identity for centuries. Even in his later years, Alfred found no peace from the north. Viking fleets still probed the coastline. Small raids, sudden landings, quick strikes meant to test the defenses he had spent a lifetime building. Scouts rode through the night to deliver warnings. Burg garrisons gathered on the ramparts. Along fortified riverbanks, Alfred's watchtowers lit their beacons. The system held, but every new threat reminded him that the kingdom's survival hung on constant vigilance. And Alfred was tired. Age, illness, and decades of strain weighed on him. Some days he worked from his bed. Others, he pushed himself to the council chamber, leaning on servants but refusing to abandon his duties. Yet even weakened, his mind remained sharp. He refined laws, settled disputes, and convened advisors late into the evenings. He walked the walls of fortified towns when he could, listening to captains and clerks, priests and farmers. Every conversation shaped the kingdom he continued to mold. And he taught Edward not just how to rule, but how to think, how to read the land, how to read people, how to read history. Alfred understood his time was finite. His reforms had to outlive him. So these final years became a race against the clock, to strengthen the foundations, to guard the frontiers, and to ensure that what he had rebuilt would not crumble the moment he was gone. Every Viking raid tested his defenses. Every council meeting revealed new problems. Every decision mattered. This was the last chapter of a king who refused to fade, holding England together with sheer will, even as his body weakened. Alfred died in 899, around 50 years old, a long life for his era. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records his passing with almost painful brevity, a single line for a man who had rebuilt a kingdom. Yet the silence speaks volumes. In monasteries across Wessex, monks paused their quills. In burgs he had designed, bells tolled softly. Villagers gathered in candle-lit halls, whispering prayers for the king who had saved them. They had lost more than a monarch, they had lost the anchor of their world. But his work did not end with him. Edward, his son, continued the reforms, strengthening burghs, refining laws, expanding the realm. And a generation later, Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan, would complete what Alfred began, forging the first unified kingdom of England. Alfred never lived to see the nation he envisioned, but the foundations he laid, education, law, defense, identity, were already shaping a future he had imagined against impossible odds. His reign ended. His legacy had only begun. He saved more than a kingdom, he saved its memory. At Alfred's command, monks fanned out across the realm, copying every book they could find before Viking raids could destroy them. Those manuscripts became the backbone of English learning. He strengthened the law, giving future kings a framework to build on. He organized fortified towns that protected trade and everyday life. He reformed coinage, rebuilt defenses, and pushed for a literate clergy who could govern wisely. The imprint of his reforms is still visible today, in the English language, in legal traditions, in the idea of a unified nation. Alfred showed that real power isn't only won on the battlefield. It's secured through ideas, institutions, and education. In a world breaking apart, he imagined a future worth living in, and built it, one reform, one book, one fortified town at a time. Only one English king is remembered as the Great, and Alfred earned it in the harshest way possible. At his lowest moment, he hid in the marshes of Athelney while invaders burned his kingdom. Yet even then, he was planning its recovery. Alfred wasn't a conqueror chasing glory. He fought simply to keep his people alive. He didn't learn for prestige. He learned so knowledge could defend a crumbling society. And he didn't rule for the moment. He ruled with the future in mind, rebuilding towns, restoring laws, and shaping a culture that would outlast him by centuries. In a brutal, chaotic medieval world, his courage, intellect, and vision weren't just rare. They were revolutionary. And that is why history remembers him, singularly, as the Great. A king who died over 1,000 years ago still appears everywhere today, towering in statues, analyzed in university lectures, debated in documentaries, and portrayed in modern TV dramas. But how well do we really know him? Some call Alfred a warrior, others a lawgiver, a scholar, a visionary. Each portrait captures a truth, but never the whole man. The Alfred emerging from modern research is far more compelling. A leader who improvised, adapted, and rebuilt a fragile society while enemies hovered at his borders. So when we look at those statues or screen portrayals, we're not just seeing a hero carved in stone. We're seeing the human effort, the daily decisions, and the quiet resilience that shaped the foundations of a nation. He once hid in marshes, nearly alone, while enemies burned the kingdom he was sworn to protect. Yet Alfred's resolve never broke. Every failure, every retreat sharpened him. His brilliance wasn't a gift. It was forged through courage, discipline, and relentless curiosity. When the world around him spiraled into chaos, Alfred didn't wait for stability to return. He built it. Brick by brick, law by law, burr by burr, he shaped a future his people could depend on. And the lesson he leaves us is simple. In times of uncertainty, resilience is not passive. It's active. It's a choice. In our own turbulent world, anyone seeking clarity, order, or purpose can still take a page from Alfred's playbook. As Alfred's story draws to a close, his legacy stretches across more than 1,000 years. He took a kingdom scarred by war, its towns burned, its people scattered, and rebuilt it piece by piece. He fortified the land, preserved precious knowledge from being lost to the flames, and shaped laws that would guide England long after kings and dynasties rose and fell. Alfred never chased glory. He chased solutions that would last. His life reminds us that greatness isn't carved in monuments, but in the ideas, institutions, and opportunities we leave for those who come after us. What legacy will you leave behind? Thank you for joining this journey through the life of Alfred the Great, warrior, reformer, teacher, and the quiet architect of a nation. His legacy didn't end with him. Edward the Elder carried his torch. Ethelstan transformed his foundations into the first true kingdom of England. And the world we inherit today still rests on choices Alfred made in a time of fire and uncertainty. As you watch the last images fade, from the old hills of Wessex to the landscapes of modern Britain, remember this. Nations are not accidents. They're built by people who refuse to give up, even when everything seems lost. So the question Alfred leaves us with is simple. What foundations are you building for the future?